Welcome to the podcast, The Regs. I am Max, your host. Some people know me as, or just on Instagram as King of the Grayling, and that's where most people just know me. All right, and on this podcast, we are going to be talking about lots of different stuff, but all of it revolves around fish, the catching of, and regulations involving catching them, as well as ethical means and methods, and what is being a good sportsman and conservationist as far as fishing. So, not every episode will be the same amount of length of time. This is just the intro, so, to the series. So it's not going to be super long, but to start us off, the first little part of the series, we're mostly going to be talking about life histories of fish, and this is so you guys, the listeners, can better understand what I'm talking about as far as why I believe or I think they should just straight up change certain regulations over others. I'll be talking mostly about sport and subsistence, and then I'll also be talking about commercial and the controversies around around all of them. Mainly commercial, though, because there's a lot of problems with that industry. And the big problem with this state is that Alaska, first and foremost, is what's referred to as a take state. We take. We're subsistence fishers. We're subsistence hunters. We live off the land. I don't know a whole lot of people in this state who aren't into gardening to some degree. So we're mostly going to be talking about that kind of stuff. And on occasion, we'll even touch on other topics such as hunting. Although that is something I'm not totally familiar. I go predator hunting and hunt for ptarmigan occasionally, but I'm not what you would call a super serious hunter. Although I do enjoy going on hunts, whether or not I get anything. So... as our first episode, now that we're through the intro, now that I've explained to you what we're going to be talking about, we are going to be talking about some key differences in lake ecology that need to be understood as far as making regulations towards them. Now, I think general regulations for the state are the most disgusting thing ever. It is such a lazy, half-assed thing. It's just, like, I understand that you cannot make regulations on a drainage-by-drainage basis or lake-by-lake basis, whatever you want to call it, because there are over 3 million lakes, let alone, how many streams of running water there are with fish in them in this state. But there needs to be made a greater effort to just make the regulations more specific, is what I'm saying, for particular lakes and whatnot. Because, like, the big one that I'm going to talk about as far as what regulations need to change for what fish is lake trout mostly and whitefish. And the other fin fish, what's listed as other fin fish, having no limit or no listing of what means you can really use beyond, not using explosives and gill nets and stuff like that. That needs to be gone with. Personally, I don't care if it's a fish in this state. It has to have some kind of regulation behind it. Even if it's just sculpin, which no one like, and the limit for them could be like 10. My point is, we need to start preserving the things we do have now rather than later, so it doesn't come and bite us in the ass like humans tend to do. They're lazy, and we don't want to fix anything sooner rather than later if it's going to cost us money. So, that being said, I need to tell you the differences between M&A lakes and non-M&A lakes. M&A lakes are marine nutrients available. So a great example of an M&A lake that I'm sure a lot of people would know about is the Kenai Lake. So the Kenai Lake has every year an influx of nutrients and biomass brought up from the sea by salmon or dollies and even lamprey. And lamprey, if you don't know what a lamprey is, I'm sure you've seen a picture of this if you're listening to this podcast. It's just think of it like a big old eel with a disc of teeth, for a mouth, and it looks kind of like a sucker, and they suck onto other fish and they drink their blood, essentially. And lamprey are generally in no way good for the environment, or at least other fish populations, beyond two things. One, they bring a lot of biomass to the drainage, which may not directly feed any fish or anything like that, but it will passively bring them biomass and keep the stream or lake productive for a long period of time. Same with the salmon. So let's take a hypothetical pink salmon, okay? So this pink salmon moves upstream all the way into the Kenai Lake, okay? It spawns and its body dies, and its body gets consumed by decomposers like fungus, like saprolegnia, or even is munched on by rainbows or burbot, whatever you want. It gets eaten one way or another by bugs, insects, fish, fungus, decomposers, okay? Its eggs do get eaten to some degree, and some of those eggs will survive. So, and these dead salmon feed these planktonic blooms of copepods, Daphnia, and zygotes, which in turn feed a lot of things. Everything from juvenile lake trout, burbot, and rainbow trout to the salmon when they, after they get through their alvin stage and they lose their yolk sac and they start to eat, to insects. It literally feeds everything. And that's the big thing about an M&A lake, because it has so much biomass moving into it over a pretty good period of time, bringing up all this nutrients. It tends to stay or have a higher level of productivity as far as fish populations, how often those fish populations spawn, and actually their ages too, because fish don't need to live as long if they can collect the amount of biomass they need to reproduce in a shorter period of time. So this is why a lake trout in the Kenai Lake may mature at like 5 years versus a lake trout on the North Slope, which doesn't have any M&A influence, may mature after 7 or 8 years, but still be at the same size. Let's say 20 inches. So a 20-inch lake trout in an M&A lake may be, may only be like 20 inches and only 5 years old, but a lake trout on the North Slope could very well be the same length, but 7 or 8 years old, And interestingly enough, this is kind of a law for most fish in the state, where if you put the latitudes across the state and put a fish all the way down the latitudes at the same size from the northernmost to the southernmost, let's say lake trout again, they're all 20 inches. As you go along further north, the size stays the same, sure, but the age per size goes up. And the later that these fish mature in life goes up too. And this is a big factor into why I think general regulations are absolutely hot garbage and need to change. And regulations need to be also based a little bit more around this fact than really just like region or drainage. All right. So those are that's the big difference between an M&A lake and a non-M&A lake, is that M&A lakes are just higher productivity, have more fish in them. The fish tend to mature at a younger age than fish of the same species and even in the same region in a non-M&A lake. All right. So that being said, this is going to be a big factor when I'm telling you guys what kind of regulations I would recommend for a particular place. So, a lot of this is going to be me telling you knowledge. So, just be prepared for that. And I hope you guys enjoy it. So, with the M&A lakes versus the non-M&A lakes in mind, early on in the first episode, I'm going to be going through the life histories of a lot of these fish. They'll be pretty quick for the most part. And to start us off, I'm going to be talking about... you know what? Since they are the most common, we will talk about the pink salmon. And pink salmon, I absolutely do not like pink salmon. I think they're the only use that they have in my mind beyond people who need it for subsistence is that they are a cheap means of producing protein for planet Earth. So let's go back to our hypothetical pink salmon in the Kenai Lake. So this pink salmon just died. Its body is gone. It's been eaten by bugs and decomposers and other fish. And it has fueled a planktonic bloom in the lake that now feeds all the juvenile fishes as well as insects and invertebrates. All right. So now there's an egg in the gravel, and this egg is absorbing thermal units. And thermal units, they're just like... So if the temperature... And let me tell you, a thermal unit is just a unit of energy that comes from the temperature in the lake. And it's a way of measuring in a hatchery setting how far along in development the egg is. So at... Let's say, okay, this egg is just, been spawned. It has only absorbed, let's say the water is 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's 50 degrees for you in Fahrenheit. So it has absorbed over the 24-hour period 10 thermal units, okay? And as winter approaches and the water gets colder and colder and colder, it absorbs less and less thermal units. It develops slower, and eventually, after it's absorbed around 350 thermal units, it is an eyed egg. So most of everything in the egg is developed. It's got 2 eyes, it's got its yolk sac, its tail, its spine, but it's still not quite done yet. And so, fast forward even more, after absorbing even more thermal units, it's still winter, the egg is hatched, okay? Now that this egg is hatched, the 11 is alive, what it's going to do is it's going to burrow even further into the substrate, whether it's in a stream or the gravel of the Kenai Lake. And salmon tend to need, sandy, gravelly substrate. If it's mud, it won't do, because mud will basically, to tell a horky dorky version, what'll happen is the gills of the fish will get clogged and gummed up with mud where they cannot breathe, so they'll just die. Okay, so our pink salmon is alive, he's happy, he's burrowed into the ground, and he's still absorbing thermal units. He's eating up his yolk sac. He's developing more. And one other thing he's doing while this is all happening is with all his wiggling and whatnot, he's developing the muscles that will propel him through the ocean later in life, little by little. And eventually, what will happen is all of these fish, once they've absorbed their yolk sac, will literally just pop out of the ground. Normally at night, over like a 2-week period, but this could be longer because not all drainages or populations of fish do the exact same things. For instance, lake sockeye versus river spawning sockeye. Lake sockeye may not rise as sooner as river sockeye will. It's just a difference in environment because of I don't remember exactly why, beyond just the ones that spawn in a lake just don't rise as quickly as the ones who do spawn in streams. I could take a guess. The guess would probably be because the ones in a stream need to move to the lake sooner so they can develop and eat planktonic animals so they can get big enough to eventually go out to the ocean the following year. All right, back to our pink salmon. So our pink salmon is hatched. He's an 11. Now he's gobbled up his yolk sac. His yolk sac gets absorbed into him and turns into his stomach. And so, unlike most other species of salmon, they don't spend much time in fresh water at all. The majority of their lives, like the ratio of time spent in the ocean versus time spent in fresh water is the second largest. It's like a 3-to-1 in terms of time. So this pink salmon has only spent maybe like 6 months in fresh water. Okay. And now it's popped out of the ground, and in one mass movement, all these pink salmon are running down the stream and directly into the salt water during the springtime. And they're getting eaten by little baby freshwater sculpin, rainbow trout, lake trout, burbot, grayling, whitefish. Everything is tackling these fry. Everything. I mean everything. Birds too, even other animals to some degree. And so then they spend some time in the estuary because they have to get used to the salinity difference between salt and fresh. Fun fact for you, pink salmon can actually spawn in salt water, and their eggs can rear in salt water. And so the fish could be on a beach and be in the ocean its entire life until it comes back to spawn. And it might go to the same spot, or it might go into the freshwater stream. Think of it like this. Freshwater streams for pink salmon as well as chum salmon aren't necessarily what they need to spawn. They just need something to home in on so the rest of their species can come and so they can all spawn. They do have a preference towards freshwater, but it's not a necessity is what I'm getting at. And the main purpose of the stream for chums as well as pinks is, again, just homing. Something to home in on for them to come and spawn and whatnot. So, now that our pink salmon has survived all these predators, all these insects trying to eat him, as well as even other salmon smolt that live longer in the system, now he's entered the salt water, and he hits in all pink salmon, as well as salmonoid species that are anadromous. Anadromous means that they go to salt to fresh or vice versa in a parts of their life. So, to give you an example, king salmon would be anadromous. Lamprey would be anadromous. Rainbow trout would be semi-anadromous because not all of their species go out to the ocean. Some stay, some may leave and become steelhead. And what happens to a lot of these species of fish is they develop the cells to exchange salinity and salt out of their bodies, so they can survive the marine environment. And then another thing that happens is their immune system kicks into overdrive. Their bodies essentially start gathering data on what, like a human body does in its early stages of life. We're getting dirty, we're putting things in our mouth, we're collecting bacteria and viruses, and our body's building up a database of how to fight these pathogens in our new environment. And so pink salmon and all salmon are doing the same. And they're also hitting a growth spurt. And this is at the point where fish technically become a smolt. They hit what's called smoltification, and all of these things that I just said happen at once. They're developing the cells to exchange salinity. Their immune system is kicking into overdrive, and they're hitting a growth spurt. So they hit smolt stage. Some will mill around for a little while in the estuary. Some will start schooling up and head out into the great big blue we call the ocean. So pink salmon will come back after 2 years of being in fresh water. They are what is referred to as a two ocean fish. And so and this is just on an evolutionary scale. This is a big reason why there's so many pink salmon. Evolution tends to favor a quicker, shorter life than a longer, life. This is part of the reason that there is so many pink salmon versus like silvers, for instance. All right. And so these pink salmon are now just running around the ocean, eating all kinds of good planktonic animals. And then once they get big enough, they start eating on things like sand lance or sand eels, whatever you want to call them, herring, smelt, like hooligan. They'll even eat squid, just anything that can fit in their mouths, pretty much. But they tend to focus on eating other fishes. And fun fact for you, the reason a pink salmon or just a salmon's meat takes on the coloration of that ruby red or deep orange it does is because the same chemical that turns a shrimp red when you boil it in water is the same chemical that the fish absorb into their bodies and turns their meat that color. So that's why. Now you know. And this is why like sockeye salmon have such a deep ruby red coloration in their meat, is because the majority of their diet is planktonic animals and crustaceans in the marine environment that they munch on. Whereas like a king salmon, a white king might exist or they do exist. Make no mistake, there is such a thing as white kings. White kings exist because they just decided that they wanted to eat almost only other fish rather than eating crustaceans or things like that. So they just did not absorb as much of that chemical than all the other salmon did, or their other brothers and sisters, whatever you want to put it as. So our pink salmon is now much, much, much bigger. He's eaten all of his greens and goods and vegetables and all the things that are going to make him grow big and strong, which is just, protein. So they've gone out, they've collected all of this protein. They're bigger. They developed the organs to reproduce. And so now they're bodies say it's time to head back to the home stream. And so what happens is there is, to put it simply, there is a magnet in their head. iron molecules align with the magnetic north and south so that they have a general heading of where they're going to go. Once they get within a certain, you know, distance, they'll start homing in on their stream, not just by, the poles, but by pure scent. Excuse me. And pink salmon have very poor, homing abilities. They suck, in fact, to the point where pink salmon that were farmed in Russia are now in Lake Loch Ness in Scotland in the UK. They just slowly meandered over because their homing sucks that much. So all salmon do this to varying degrees. They do what's called straying, where they will not, a certain percent of them will not return to their home stream. They'll go and spawn with other salmon in another drainage, pretty much. Or, just, that's pretty much it. Which is why you might see like a, now for instance, sockeye cannot spawn or rear in a drainage that has no lakes. They need lakes to live. So you'll still see some sockeye that spawn in a stream, for instance, but those fry are eventually going to head to a lake where they'll live and rear and spawn. Or not spawn yet, but rear and live. And that's just because of their life history, which of course I will talk about, because they have a very interesting life history compared to all the other salmon species, and they are the greatest influencer of predator behavior as far as char and lake trout and all those other salmonoids. But, anyways, my point is with that, salmon stray, so that's why you might see, a species of salmon in a stream that you didn't know that there were all those species of salmon, in that stream. They're pretty much just, think of it like they're just visiting to see if there's any hot salmon ladies around to go and, make more salmon with. So, our pink salmon is now heading back, and he's having to face all these wonderful new predators, such as halibut, which they do feed pelagically just as much as they feed on the bottom. Pelagically means basically mid-water column. So halibut aren't just glued to the bottom. I know, big shocker. That's why you pick some up trolling a lot. Anyways, so they got halibut, they've got giant yellow-eye rockfish and lingcod, then they've got seals, all of these things. Even people, commercial fishermen. I pick pink salmon trolling all the time. It's annoying because it's a kind of a pain to reset the whole rig, and I don't like pink salmon. I think they're gross. Full disclosure, pink salmon aren't that gross to eat when they're chrome. If they're spawned out, I just will look at you funny if you're keeping spawned out pinks. Because why don't you just treat yourself better than that? Unless you're like feeding it to your dog or something, because that's understandable, and dog food is kind of expensive. So, our pink salmon head back to the stream, and it just decides, because there are a lot of mates around by the beach, it's going to spawn by the beach. It doesn't want to go all the way back up to the Kenai Lake where it was born. So it spawns there, its offspring live in the salt and surf, and then the cycle continues. And some of its brethren that did come back didn't even bother to go to the Kenai Lake. They decided they wanted to go to the Susitna River, for instance, So, there you go. That's a life history of pink salmon. Now, let me tell you a little bit about pink salmon and the hatchery scene. I believe that there are too many pink salmon. And the reason that I think hatcheries are producing too many pink salmon, the big reason is the fact that just through sheer overwhelming numbers, they're out competing a lot of the other fish species, not just other salmon, for food. And that may be a big factor to as why you see less of everything else. So the reason hatcheries do produce pink salmon is because it's only 6 months that they're at the house. It's only 6 months of pouring water on them, 6 months of just, eventually doing an egg pick, separating the good eggs from the bad eggs. It's only 6 months, where you have to rear and feed them so they get bigger, and then you just release them. And then the return is quick because they return after just being only 2 years in the ocean. And so, and the returns for them, because of that, are really good. So then you can have all these commercial fishermen come in, do what's called cost recovery, where taxes from the commercial fishermen go back to the hatchery, so the hatchery can continue to produce fish for the commercial fishermen and not have to take away from wild stocks. So, here's my big grievance with this process, is the fact that pink salmon do not need any hatchery help in Alaska. Taking from wild stocks would be far better in my mind than it would be taking from hatchery-made stocks. So, the reason being is because there are so many pink salmon, when they move up a river, they might dig all the other salmon that are more favorable, like sockeye or chums or kings especially. They might dig up all of those eggs. All of those eggs are now gone, and now there's pink eggs everywhere. So you just lost, let's say, 30% of all the previous runs of salmon that just came up that river, like that, just gone. Okay, and then on top of that, there are so many of them, they're eating all the food that other salmon species can't compete for because there's too many pink salmon. The predators can't keep up with demand, essentially, and eat all of the pink salmon, fry, and then the pink salmon go out to the ocean, and the whole story. The big reason that pink salmon might be a big help in this instance is because of all the biomass they bring up. They create a really big planktonic bloom. They bring up so much nutrients. And then there are so many pink salmon that it might be harder for a predator to catch a red or, a silver in a given stream, something that's more favorable. So there is a pro to this, but it may not be necessarily a great one in my mind. Because there's still far more of a less favorable species in terms of food quality and economic value, because pink salmon are dirt cheap as far as harvesting them compared to harvesting literally any other salmon. So that's the big reason why I think pink salmon need to be caught more wild than they do being produced in a hatchery setting. Pink salmon are just too many of them, and they can outcompete everything in a stream just because of sheer overwhelming numbers. That's the bottom line. So if you take away from those wild stocks, because pink salmon come back so quickly, you might increase the bycatch for other things like silvers or chums, because those are the two other species that spawn closest to when pink spawn. But I think in this instance you would be doing more good than harm. It's not like when you go and you're commercially harvesting sockeye and the commercial guys are like, oh no, we got 20 kings in our net, we gotta quote unquote throw them back, because it's against the law. Yeah. Gosh. King salmon are kind of doomed. But I don't know. We'll see. Because I always believe it's 1,000 little things. It's that one guy who just takes a picture and releases. That's that little bit of help goes a long ways, and you may not think about it. Or they just extend the season where kings can be left alone just a week longer. Just little bit things like that, And there's almost no commercial value to king salmon just because there's so few of them. The amount that the state can produce is very minuscule compared to all the other species just because there's so few of them. But supply and demand, so kings are very expensive, and that's why there's still a lot of harvest for them. Even though there are far more numerous fish of just as good eating quality around later in the year. All right. So, and here's one other thing about pink salmon. I think that there might have, and I can't figure this out on my own. I would need a lab and scientific help doing this. But a theory I had was that at one point, instead of there being so many pink salmon around, because it's generally believed that there's always more pink salmon than everything else. But what if long ago, before humans showed up with commercial fishing practices, there were more more king salmon than pink salmon? Think about it like that. So king salmon were considered the nuisance, not pink salmon. And basically, this is how these commercial fishing industries in the West would work back when the Wild West was a thing, anyways, in a lot of the Western United States. The first fish to show up would be the first to be wiped out. That's just how it works. So kings would show up, they would be caught until they're wiped out and demand was met. And then eventually, when there were no more kings, they would move on to sockeye, caught and kept and sold until they're wiped out. Then after sockeye, it would be chums, rinse and repeat. Then pinks, rinse and repeat. And then silvers, rinse and repeat. So because of this process, kings being the first, and when demand was the most high at the beginning of the year and stores were low, kings would be the first to be wiped out. So it would make sense in my mind for there to be far more kings than everything else, just because they got wiped out first. And this may be a great reason to why kings in the past did so well, obviously because human intervention wasn't around as much, but because there's so many of them that the fact that they live so long, they could sustainably keep and maintain their population and weren't outcompeted by things like pink salmon moving up in the billions, digging out all their eggs in a stream and whatnot. It's just a theory, but I would like to believe that there's some plausibility to it. Because, way back when, Indians ruled the land, they didn't have any scientific thinking to what they were doing. Not really, anyways. They weren't collecting fish and counting every single one to get an accurate estimate of what the population was like. They didn't think about sustainably fishing beyond just throwing bones back into the water so that they could turn back into the salmon that they kept and they would return. They just had their practices for, their religious practices, and they respected the hell out of the salmon, but they didn't understand, how they worked on a scientific or biological level. So my point is with that, who knows, there was not a whole lot of accurate record keeping around the time. So I did ask this same question to my assistant manager at a hatchery I worked at. while we were all doing some great old underwater basket weaving. We weren't actually doing a task like that. We were weaving baskets, and it was for a purpose. Those for BKD testing on silver salmon. But I'll talk about that later. So, and she said there was a way to, I forget exactly what she said. There was a way to test this with some accuracy. That was basically looking at carbon evidence by streams and whatnot and seeing how much, old rendered biomass from each species was around X amount of millions of years ago, or not millions of years ago, hundreds of years ago, sorry. Something along those lines. Oh man, I really wish I remember what she said. But anyways, there is a way to do it, and I would really like to do it. However, I do not have the equipment or the labs to do that. But anyways, in the comments, tell me what you think about that, because wouldn't you like to have millions of king salmon instead of millions of pink salmon? Like, king salmon, one of the most favored sport fish on the North American continent, versus pink salmon, which are mostly just commercial value and don't really do much in terms of sport fishing value. They're kind of one of those things that tourists come up here, check off on their list. They never caught one of those before, and then that's that. Which is kind of funny to me. I don't know. It's just the kind of like, I live here, so I'm a snobby local looking at these tourists keeping and catching pink salmon. Like, ugh, you're actually going to eat those? But, it's whatever. I'm sure if I went to where they lived and was keeping like suckers or carp, they would have the same sort of, thinking as I do. Like, oh, you're actually going to eat those? It's just kind of something funny that I think about every so often. Like, tourists that come up here, and this has turned into more rambling, I know, but I did tell you the life history of pink salmon, so that was my main point. But like, actually, that brings me to another thought. One other benefit to pink salmon is that because there's so many of them, the tourists don't wipe out other stocks of fish that are more valued, either subsistence-wise or commercially, or subsistence, or I said that already, or sport-wise. So there's another benefit to the kings, but you could argue if that there were just as many kings as there were pinks, the same thing would be the case, really. Only they'd be more sport. No? Well, yeah, they'd be both sport and subsistence and commercially valued more if there were more of them. I suppose because they'd be easier to get a hold of. But the, price for kings would go down just because they would meet the demand more. But anyways, yeah, I think pinks are great for the one thing and one thing along the other things I said, which is they keep tourists who don't know focused on pink salmon and leaving other species alone, which is a huge help, because anyone who lives in the south central of the state knows that tourists are not generally liked beyond their economic value. And here's my thing with tourists. Tourists are environmentally bad. Tourists trash stream beds. They trample them to such a degree that it erodes streams, and you lose out on good spawning grounds for salmon. They contribute to the good old Russian River, Kenai River lead mine, which I'll talk about when I get to talking about sockeye salmon, which will be the next episode, actually. So just stay tuned for that. And what I mean by the lead mine is when all these flossers and whatnot and flippers, people who like come up here, buy a. I used to work at Sportsman's Warehouse, so I know this from firsthand experience. When people come up here, buy a fly rod, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go fly fish the Kenai for some reds, and they buy a Russian River fly and some lead weights, and I'm like, no, that's not actually fly fishing, you're just flossing. Fly fishing, the whole point of fly fishing is to get the fish to willingly bite. This is just lining a fish in the mouth. It's just glorified snagging. There was one time, this lady I referred to as the Montana lady, and Montana has a reputation for having some of the best trout fly fishing in the state, by the way. So some people have a pretty big ego towards fly fishing and what they know, just like some people up here do. They just don't have any humility. I try to have a lot of humility when it comes down to what I know. However, I don't know everything, so there you go. Just proving what I was just saying. I was talking to this guy about why flossing is not fly fishing, and he, was like, okay, those are some fair points, and, I set him up with what he wanted to do, and I'm sure he caught plenty of reds and whatnot at the Russian River, and, this lady, the whole time I was talking to him, was behind him, like, scoffing, like, yeah, I can't even recreate the noises. And I actually thought that was the guy's mom, because why else would she just be standing there? And this lady, I she just keeps staring at me, and I say, could I help you with anything? And she just turns around and walks away, and I'm like, okay. And I walk behind. At the Sportsman's in Anchorage, we have this little fly bar. We call it the fly bar. And I stand there doing something. And the lady comes back and she's like, why isn't fly fishing? Like, with the most snarky attitude imaginable. And I'm just like, and I list out point A, B, C, and D, it's not... Fly rods aren't meant to do what you're using them for. Another thing is the whole point of fly fishing is to be a sportsman, not to just be a subsistence fisherman. The point is to get the fish to willingly bite. Again, not just snag it in the mouth. And I tell her this, and she's like, well, what do you know? I'm from Montana, where there are real fly fishermen. And then walks away, and I'm just like, what? It's just such a stupid, funny interaction. I laugh at it today, and I think about it sometimes too. Quite often. It's just really funny to me, that's all. She's just some lady who's too big for her britches, I suppose. And I completely lost the point I was trying... Oh, yeah. Tourists aren't very good for the state because they're just very environmentally damaging unless the infrastructure is in place for them, like walkways, which there is one on the Russian River. But these tourists go everywhere. They track their trash everywhere. They buy things up here just to throw them in the dumpster by the Russian River, for instance, or the Kenai River. I'm not exactly sure where the dumpster is, but I know there's a dumpster there, and I know it's a good place to pick up free fishing gear. So there you go. There's an insider tip. If you want to find some good free fishing gear, just go to that dumpster. And I can't tell you how often the store... I don't really care anymore. I'm over working in... I just am so over with working in retail. At least at Sportsman's, these people would come back after they broke their fly rods, trying to floss and flip, and just be like, you told me this would work for catching reds, but this didn't work. The rod broke and I lost the fish. And I'm like, well, did you try to horse the fish up onto the stream? Did you do this? Did you do that? I list off like every single way that they would have broken a fly rod, flossing and whatnot. And I got to the point where I could just look at the rod and be like, yeah, you snapped it in a car door. You're not fooling me. Or, yeah, you tried to horse the fish up, didn't you? And you broke. Yeah, I've broken a fly rod every which way before. So I just know from experience what does what. Because I've made the mistakes. So, yeah, and then these people would argue like, no, I was using it properly. And I'm like, and occasionally I would bait them into just telling me without telling me, and I'd be like, so you were fly fishing, right? And you just hooked up on the fish, and the fish, got to the shoreline. You tried to just pull it up, and they were like, yeah, and then it just, broke, and I don't know why. I thought I was meant to do this. And I'm like, yeah, you were horsing the fish up on the stream. That's what you were doing. It's not a good example, but my point still stands that these people would just, yeah, and the store would lose out on so much money from returns from all these broken rods. That voice crack, though. It was just amazing to me. Oh, gosh. What a shame. Because you already know why. It's just what a big shame. Stupid tourists who don't know what they're doing. Yeah. Anyways. Yeah. Oh. Also, one other thing that I don't like as far as tourism goes is when all these tourists come up here, it tends to attract carnies, if you will. And what I mean by carnies is people who are scumbags in the entertainment industry. And most of these scumbags up here, and of course, not all lodges or guides are created equal. I'm talking in broad strokes, because I know some fishing guides who are some of the most fantastic, ethical, and great conservationist people, like in the state, probably even in the world. So my point is, not all created equal. Some are worse than others, and I'd say one of the highest concentrations of scumbag carnies in the world is in Alaska because of the amount of tourism we have here. So, there are people who come up here and work for 6 months out of the year and then leave, taking the money that they made with them, so that money doesn't return to the state quite as the same as if the people lived here year round. That's one problem I have with the carnies in this state. Then another is the fishing and hunting guides that don't, especially the ones who don't live up here, they have no respect for the locals. For instance, this is just something that happened to me this year. When I was at a field camp at the, we'll call it the Pepper Lake Lodge. And I'm sure you can kind of guess what lodge it is, because what other thing is commonly put with pepper? Let you think about that for a second. So anyways, at the Pepper Lake Lodge, where I'd go to field camps, these two guides are the kind of guides, and I understand that they're there to work and do a job, but these people were just like, and I've done some guiding myself. I know what a good fly fishing guide should do and be, and I understand, and it's babysitting, and it gets tiresome, but you're there to do a job, and you're not there to be an ass to the locals. Anyways, so I was there, I was fishing, enjoying my time, fishing these wonderful Arctic char. These Arctic char were the most southern population of Arctic char in the state. They're uber cool, very unique. I'll have to talk about them sometime. And I was parked on the shore, and what these two guides decided to do is they pulled up maybe 5 feet behind me from where my little boat was. It was like I think a 20-foot Zodiac with a 20 horse on it, or maybe a 15-foot. It was a pretty sizable Zodiac, is my point. And all of these tourists, and this is a good example of maybe taking advantage of the lack of knowledge that tourists might have, or the tourists just don't care and don't have any respect for the people around them. They just came, they paid to get there to catch fish, so they just want to catch fish, and they'll bulldoze anyone in their way, you know, if it means that they're going to get their fish. So these guides pull up. These people are there for their first day, I can tell, especially because a plane came in earlier today, and I saw them pick up people and drop off people. Or maybe the previous day. Anyways, they were fresh. They hadn't been out there very long. And these people were just like standing there, you know, whipping their rods around, and none of these people knew how to fly fish, save for like 2 of them. And these 2 guides were just standing there not doing jack shit. They're just jaw jacking, not helping their clients out. And if I was one of those people, I'd be pissed. Like, what are you doing? Help me learn how to do this, so you can actually earn your tip. Don't just stand there like a beanpole, you know. And so I'm ignoring it, and eventually I can't help myself, and I try to, because I'm fly fishing too, and so I say something to this one lady next to me, how to cast it just real quick, and I say it very softly and calmly. I'm not like, I don't walk over and take her rod in my hand and start showing her. I just tell her, and she starts really getting it out there. And I'm like, good job. It's, you know. And the guide, one of them saw me talking to her, and she started to improve. And then he comes over and starts telling her to essentially do the opposite. And now they're just single hand fly fishing, and I just told her essentially how to do a front load, you know, to get the fly out there, because you don't, where we were, you don't have to cast very far on the lake to catch a fish because it's a deep drop off. No, and the guide is just over there, you know. It's only after the fact that I try to help this lady that he actually starts doing his job. And then after that, I caught a few fish before then. I caught one when they showed up, and I caught a couple after they showed up. And he starts slowly positioning his clients closer and closer around me. And now I'm a big guy, okay? I have a wingspan that's close to 6 feet. And I could stick out my arms and touch people on the shoulders on each side. And I was just like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Like, stop crowding me. There's an entire freaking lake. I was here way before any of you people, and you're just trying to do the numbers thing to, you know, get me to go away. And eventually I did. After that, I felt like they won, but I actually had to go, so not really. But it was just really shitty practicing as a guide. Yeah, not cool. Really not cool at all. So, and on top of that, I've also heard a lot of other things about the Pepper Lake Lodge. After it was sold to the new owner, the guides that were hired after that were not very, I won't go into really any detail, but they were not very nice to a lot of the people on that stream, essentially doing what the new guides did to me, but way worse. And then on top of that, I discovered after I got back from that field camp that the locals really do not like that lodge at all, not even the other lodges on the same stream, because they're just well known as choking out people who are already fishing on that stream with their clients. Now, I'll give them this. There aren't a ton of holes on that stream that are easily accessible. Like, there are a ton of holes to fish on that stream that are good spots to fish. But a lot of the time they're running around on side by sides and ATVs. So they're trying to be, trying to get to the places that are access convenient. But where they go, they just, straight up choke people, locals, out of their spots to, get their fish. And I'm not talking about with like sockeye so much, because combat fishing and sockeye go together like peanut butter and jelly. It's just, the two go hand in hand. That's one thing the Russian River is famous for instance, is combat fishing, flossing for sockeye. That's not what I'm talking about with these guys. I'm talking about with these guys is they have an entire stream to go fish, plenty of opportunity to try spots, but they always go where everyone else is and choke everyone else out of their spots. Whether or not they could go downstream and intercept the fish first, or it's just, it's pretty awful. In another instance of them choking out people, there was on Pepper Lake where we launch our boat and store our boat. There's a spot you can walk across the lake to, because it's shallow. It's where the stream lets out, so it's pretty shallow there. There's a couple there fishing on the other side. They're pretty spread out, and then the lake lodge shows up with their boats, parks on the same side, and there's just like what they did with me, crowds them out. And then I remember those people flipping them off as they rode away on their ATVs, and rightfully so. I can talk about shitty lodge practices all day long, but the bottom line about this particular one is that these are the kind of people where money only talks to them, and good ethical fishing practices like being good to thy neighbor don't feel like it applies to them, because they're only understandably concerned with, getting their clients on fish, but it's always at the expense of the people around them. So anyways, today you learned the difference between M&A lakes and non-M&A lakes, told you life history and a little bit of the hatchery and commercial setting of pink salmon in the state, and we talked about tourist, which I'll talk about again later on a episode more dedicated for it, and then also some terrible guide practices on the Pepper Lake Lodge. And so this is my outro, and stay tuned for the next episode. They will be posted every Friday. I don't have a specific time I'm going to post them, but it will be posted nonetheless. Have a good day. To all those who go to wild places in search of wild fish, always keep searching.